Welcome to the Revenue Above Replacement podcast. I'm your host, Adam Grossman. With me today is Jason Hartland. Jason, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Adam. Good to see you again.
Good to see you too. Had a little bit of a false start from your perspective in terms of some of the things that are happening where you are, but I'm glad you're able to join. And I have to say false start, I guess, since you're, obviously with the Buffalo Bills now. But why don't we start with the question we always start with, which is tell us more about your background, how you got into your position where you are now.
Sure. No, thanks. I've been in professional sports my entire career at varying levels. I started out as an intern for a minor league baseball team in Appleton, Wisconsin, which was it was a great experience. Allowed you to wear a lot of different hats, test the waters in a couple of different areas, and from there I decided I wanted to work in sports. So ended up working for the Wisconsin Timber Rattlers, and then moving on and working for a company at the time called United Sports Ventures, which was a consortium of gentlemen from New York who owned and operated multiple minor league sports teams. So I was on the management team for, at the time, the Fort Wayne Wizards, which was the Class A affiliate of the Minnesota Twins. Then that same group asked me and another individual to start an expansion minor league hockey team outside of St. Louis. At the time, it was the United Hockey League, and that was the Missouri River Otters, which starting something from the ground up was as much fun and as rewarding as you can imagine. That was a fantastic opportunity. Then I went to Chicago and worked for a small sports marketing company. The Green Bay Packers happened to be a client of ours. And with the original renovation of Lambeau Field, 2001, 2002, I was afforded the opportunity to go into corporate sponsorships for the Packers, which was fantastic. Um, really enjoyed that opportunity. I'm from Wisconsin. I'm from 20 minutes southwest of Green Bay. So, it's something that a kid in that area might grow up dreaming of being able to do. Most probably want to play for the Packers, but working for them checked that box for me. And then I was able to do a little tour of my home state teams. Mark Antanasio bought the Milwaukee Brewers in February of 2005. They made some structural changes after the season and was afforded the opportunity to go to Milwaukee and work for the Brewers for the better part of 10 years. Then Herb Cole sold the Milwaukee Bucks to a group from Milwaukee with the intent on building a new arena, revitalizing downtown Milwaukee. And I was fortunate enough to go there for the better part of 3 years and work on the naming rights for Fiserv Forum, as well as a number of other things. And during my tenure with the Bucks, the Brewers did a restructuring, created the chief revenue officer role, which hadn't existed before. And I was invited to return, and I was there for almost 7 years as the chief revenue officer and then as the chief commercial officer. Thought that would be my last stop as a guy from Wisconsin. Great executive team with the Brewers, great ownership. And then lo and behold, my phone rang in July of 24. And Pete Gwilly, my current boss, who I've known for a number of years, said he was back with the Bills and Sabres and doing a restructuring, created a chief commercial officer role, and I was on a short list of people he wanted to talk to about it. And while I had no intent of moving, the opportunity was too enticing to at least not entertain a conversation. And lo and behold, October 17th, after the end of the Brewers season, I relocated to Buffalo.
Yeah, a lot to get into there, and I want to, as I say a lot on this podcast, start at the beginning. What's interesting, one of the interesting components of your career is you started entrepreneurial and moved more towards established franchises and established teams and sports properties. So, you mentioned there was nothing more exciting than starting your own kind of team. So you talk about like why was that the case? What was so interesting, and what were you able to do?
I mean, yeah, for me, I was at a point in my life where I mentioned quite a few moves. I was single at the time, which made being mobile a little bit easier. But starting an expansion minor league hockey team, if anybody's worked in minor league sports, I mean, you wear all the hats. You might be in corporate sales, but you're helping with ticket sales, you're helping with group sales. But the hockey team, it was everything from naming the team, working with graphic designers to develop a logo, finding office space. I mean, it was as entrepreneurial as you could get. And St. Louis is a hockey crazed market, and it was just extremely rewarding. there was no work-life balance. It was work-work balance. But it was great. It was fun. I mean, it was a labor of love. And it's something I wouldn't trade the world for.
And that's an interesting early experience to have. So, and you mentioned working across multiple groups, which became a little bit of a theme in your career. But what was it like to work across multiple groups, understanding that revenue generation obviously can always be top of mind?
Yeah, I mean, it gave me great insights into what it takes to make an organization successful. And I also think it gave me the ability to understand where opportunities and where hurdles are in each vertical, so that you're looking at things more holistically as opposed to just having the blinders on for, let's just say, corporate sales.
And in terms of, one of the things that we have a lot of listeners of our podcast who are interested in entering in and breaking into the sports industry, outside the entrepreneurial experience, and I mentioned a little bit is on the sales side. So what did you learn about getting involved in sales, or was that something you always wanted to do from the beginning? And what did you learn about that earlier in your career?
I always thought that sales would be a big part of what I would do. But actually it really, like, the first and foremost, the best skill set for a salesperson is work ethic and drive. You got to have a little grit, and you have to be comfortable with failure.
Yeah.
Um, and there's a big difference when you're picking up the phone and saying you're working for the Fort Wayne Wizards or the Wisconsin Timber Rattlers as opposed to the Buffalo Bills or Green Bay Packers. Um, in my current situation and others, you can get a phone call back pretty quickly. That is not always the case with a minor league team. So you have to have some persistence, and that was the biggest thing it taught me.
Outside of persistence, like, particularly interacting with people who had never, or companies or people who had never heard of, either minor league hockey, your specific team, how were you able to have those conversations? What did you learn just outside of persistence from those conversations and maybe help shape things later in your career?
Well, I think you really have to work on being able to develop a narrative. And there's no cookie cutter way to approach it. So you'll have a narrative on what it means to work in minor league sports and be associated with a minor league sports team. But you also have to then look to understand, there's a big difference between speaking with potentially a regional restaurant chain, as opposed to, a national bank. Um, you just really have to craft your story and tailor it based on who you're speaking with.
That's interesting. That's something we talk about a lot in our classes in terms of narrative creation and, really understanding the audience. So as you were, obviously you had that kind of experience earlier that you made the transition both to an agency and then to the Packers. So, why, with the Packers in particular, what was appealing there? That was obviously a big jump in terms of, the type of team that you were working on.
Mhm.
I know obviously you've been a fan and you've grown up there, but what was kind of the impetus in from your perspective to jump into the Packers?
Well, obviously, there's a ton of history and tradition and success with the Packers. Um, it was at a point in time where it was the first redevelopment of Lambeau Field. I mean, it's come leaps and bounds today from even where it was in 2002. But it was a chance to be a part of that story, a part of leaning into the history and tradition, and taking the Packers from what was kind of what I'd say a mom and pop shop to help it grow, become more of a regional and national player in the partnership space.
Can you provide a little more detail about that in particular? This is one of the more common, or as we're recording this podcast, obviously the Lakers had just been sold to Mark Walters Group. That's a theme, is that there is some
Mhm.
that Mark Walters Group maybe can add some kind of facilitate a similar transition. So you being kind of in the earlier, obviously we were talking about with the Packers is much earlier. So can you talk about
Yeah,
what it was like to make that transition? What were the learnings and what was the desire to move into, a more robust offering?
for sure. Well, as most people I think are aware, the Packers are a publicly held team, run by an executive committee on board of directors, but really it's the president and CEO who acts as the de facto owner. And when I joined the Packers, a gentleman named Bob Harlan was the president and CEO, and Bob really had a vision for what the Packers could become. And during the interview process, it's in any interview, yes, I wanted the job, but I wanted to be comfortable in what I was stepping into. And Bob was instrumental in selling that vision on what, this small 32nd ranked market in the NFL could ultimately become. And it was it was an opportunity I just couldn't pass up. You know, it was not only sponsorships, but his vision for alternate revenue streams, taking the Packers Hall of Fame from an independent building run by a nonprofit and bringing it on board, expanding the Packers retail offerings and their online offerings. He really was at the forefront for changing the way the Packers were viewed, I think, in the NFL.
And from your perspective, what was, obviously it was much different going from where you were to there. So
Mhm.
even though it was a smaller team, what were some of the changes you saw moving into a, major professional and working directly for a major professional sports franchise?
I think the level of expectation, the NFL, and this is my second tour of duty with the NFL, but the level of communication from the league and among the teams is a huge benefit. Um, Kind of the forward thinking of the NFL. They're not thinking about what's going on next week. They're thinking about what's going on the next 5 to 10 years, and they're working towards that. So really just understanding kind of the vision that was laid out not only for the individual teams, but how the NFL looked at stuff it was actually a steep learning curve, but it was very valuable.
And what from, you mentioned obviously Green Bay obviously has a long lore and long history and one of the most successful on the field franchises, but I don't think people totally understand. It's kind of like what you're saying. That's the 32 ranked city, and that
Yeah.
publicity doesn't necessarily match, um, obviously the size of the market. So in terms of your initial conversations with corporate partners or potential partners, how do those conversations go, and how do you move beyond kind of the lore of the Packers to actually this is the business of the Packers?
Well, it was interesting because I mean, social media, digital, yes, it was around, but it was in its infancy stages. So understanding how you could monetize that, tell the story about, again, early on, but engagement with more Packers.com than social, quite frankly. But page views and selling beyond the walls of Lambeau Field. Um, and quite frankly, we had to right size the existing partners as well. Just because a company might have been a longtime partner of the Packers, you know, I think the landscape that I walked into, the deals were more reflective of the market size as opposed to the value of the brand. So being able to craft that narrative and tell that story and the value proposition of the brand and then right size those deals was a big part of the job.
Yeah, you mentioned this before. I meant to bring this up previously in terms of crafting the story and narrative creation and the importance of narrative creation in the sales process. That's something that I find I hear consistently too. But how do you think about that? And obviously understanding the audience is important, but how do you think about narrative creation when it comes to the sales process?
Well, it's interesting because I view every opportunity through a couple of different buckets. One is narrative creation. Two, which will hit home with you, is the data and analytics to support the narrative. I mean, it's basically a blank canvas where you're creating a painting, and no two paintings are going to be the same. Um, the data and analytics are super important, but people want to feel the connection to the brand that they're going to be associated with. So you really have to do a deep dive on what the brand is currently doing, maybe what they've historically done, understand the people you're talking to as best you can on a personal level. Because at the end of the day, I still think by and large, people do business with people and brands they like and appreciate and understand. And then they use the data and analytics to help support and back up the decision to make that investment.
Yeah, I think I've seen that even obviously coming from a more data analytics perspective, you see that you really do want to create that connection, that engagement, the mix of the quantitative and the qualitative is really important, and really understanding how alignment across brands is really important. And then, so going back to your story though about you're at the Packers, you've been there for a couple of years. There's an opportunity
Mhm.
at the Brewers. It's obviously different moving from football to baseball. What was the decision process to go from the Packers to the Brewers from your end?
So, and while it subsequently changed at the time, the Packers were, at least on the business side, a relatively flat organization. And while working for my hometown NFL team could have been great for a long time, from an advancement standpoint, I didn't see a clear path forward. So I decided to leave the Packers at the height of Brett Favre's powers, winning, divisional championships and competing to go to the Super Bowl every year, to go to the Milwaukee Brewers, who were regularly losing 100 games a year. Um, but there was an opportunity to advance my career, take more responsibility, um, and take it wasn't for me moving from Green Bay to Milwaukee. I mean, Wisconsin's not as a whole, it's 6 million people. So any relationships I had in Green Bay were quite portable to the Milwaukee area. So I didn't think my learning curve would be that steep. I had a history in minor league baseball. I wasn't going to be shocked working 81 baseball games. I'd been through the minor leagues and worked 70 to 75 games. But it was just an opportunity for growth for me that I didn't see in Green Bay at the time.
And what were some of those opportunities that you mentioned for growth? Like what were the specific areas that you thought you could grow into and start to get new responsibilities and new opportunities?
So during the interview process, sponsorships was first and foremost, but it was at the time where the folks in Boston were kind of developing Fenway Sports Group and ancillary revenue opportunities outside of the core baseball functions were becoming more and more prevalent. So once I was able to get my feet underneath me with sponsorships, I knew there would be an opportunity to kind of create that vertical for the Brewers, and it worked out that way.
What were some of the new opportunities that you were able to build?
Just, taking capital, reinvesting it into the ballpark, creating meeting and convention spaces, more corporate and social hospitality, turning at the time Miller Park into a concert venue. I think we hosted no less than, 15 to 20 concerts during my tenure. We had international soccer, just things that quite frankly weren't on the radar of the team prior to the sale.
And then you mentioned about going from a winning team to a team that had a more challenging record. Um, what was that like? And in terms of whether it's sponsorship sales, ticket sales, merchandise, people expect, oh, team's doing well, it's easier to sell. Team's not doing
Right.
well, it's harder to sell. How have you seen that in your own experience?
Got to be able to sell hope. And quite frankly, it wasn't too dissimilar from, I mean, other than the numbers being bigger with more commas and zeros, than minor league baseball because minor league baseball the players are transient, they move up, they move down, they may win, they may not. So you're selling experience, you're selling atmosphere. In the case of baseball, you're selling volume. There's 81 games, there's 2.5 to 3 million people. um, so you just have to change your mindset, and again it goes back to what narrative are you developing when you're chatting with people. The reality is the Brewers at the time had a robust minor league system. Names like Prince Fielder and J.J. Hardy and Ricky Weeks and Corey Hart were like one step away from coming into Milwaukee. So there's excitement in that regard. So again, it goes back to selling hope and then just kind of tweaking the narrative and the storytelling.
From your perspective, selling hope definitely, but what do people, I guess, buy into the hope, right? I mean, obviously there were clear players that were coming along that clearly were good prospects, but that's, sometimes it's particularly, I guess, more now, but even at the time, fans can be a little jaded, right? Or partners can be a little jaded. So how do you connect that message of hope potentially with people who are a little more jaded?
Well, again, it goes back to your particular audience. I wouldn't
Yeah.
say there's any one cookie cutter way to do it. There you just have to be able to know who you're speaking with and read the room. There might be some people where you shouldn't be talking about hope because
Yeah.
they've heard it before. Maybe you're talking about again the volume of games, the experience, the affordability, the fact that I'll just compare and contrast baseball to football. Football typically you'll have, in the case of the Packers, they're sold out on a season ticket basis.
Yeah.
If you're a partner with the Brewers, you're going to have a more diverse mix of audience over 81 games, and your message is going to resonate with a wider swath of people, just given the accessibility of tickets. So just depends on who you're sitting with and what their goals are.
And one of the things you mentioned previously with the Packers is kind of the rise of digital platforms and digital technologies. Particularly with the Brewers, given you were there from 2005 to 15, there was an explosion of digital technology, social media. How did that impact your experience, particularly from a sales and fan engagement side?
So it's interesting. I'm sure you're aware of ML BAM at the time. So baseball was a unique experience in that Major League Baseball central office or BAM controlled largely the digital assets. We had the ability to include them in sponsorship packages, but pricing, engagement, number of impressions, that was all driven by the league office. So that was a balancing act. I know the Brewers kind of outkicked our coverage relative to market size for being at the forefront of including digital assets and sponsorship packages. But it was, you're not a master of your own domain in that respect. So, it's working not only with the partner, but with the central office to make sure whatever you're including, you're able to execute on and deliver.
And that's an interesting point with the unique structure of MLB and MLB Advanced Media. What was that relationship like, and how were you able to navigate kind of what you're talking about in terms, particularly in terms of the inclusion of
I
digital
mean,
assets?
it was good, but it wasn't without its challenges. Trying to explain that, charging the same thing in Milwaukee that you're charging in LA probably doesn't make sense. And just it was as much education on the team's part with the league as it was the team's part with the partner. So it ended up being fine, but it was not without challenges, that's for sure.
And then on the partner side, particularly as these new assets are coming along, there's some potentially echoes from what some technology developments, particularly in artificial intelligence now. But when you're first presenting these new platforms, technologies, activation opportunities, how do you present these new opportunities to folks who may not have familiarity with what they are as much as maybe you think they could?
Well, that was an education process for sure. Just explaining what reach and engagement is when it was early on in the process. Um, and the other challenge was there, where I will say there was a huge benefit to BAM is kind of holding the line on value and investment, because there were a lot of teams and leagues outside of baseball who were just, throwing in digital assets because largely a number of people didn't understand the value. So trying to explain that, yeah, a sign in the ballpark, 2.5 million people are going to see it. This digital component, we're going to have 100 million people see it. So just, it just kind of educational in nature.
And in terms of, in addition to in addition to digital assets, so the idea of how the games are consumed started to change also. As you mentioned, MLB TV or MLB Advanced Media, MLB TV, it's the starting of streaming, the even at that point, the growth of regional sports networks. How did media consumption and what you were thinking about, what the team was experiencing from a media consumption perspective, impact what you were doing?
So, I mean, the reality is Wisconsin, I'll just say as will come as no surprise, most technology starts on the coast and it kind of works its way to the Midwest. So people in Wisconsin were largely tied to the regional sports network. We were consistently in the top three in local ratings. So we really didn't have to change much the consumption narrative really until the last couple of years with cord cutting and things of that nature. But it wasn't a challenge that we really had to hit head on, just given our geography and location.
So you were with the. I definitely want to get into the Bucks experience soon because I think there's a lot of interesting components to talk about. But within the 10 years, you're obviously being at a sports property for 10 years. You can see a lot of things change. You can see a lot of things evolve and grow. So what were some of your takeaways from your first kind of 10-year stint with the Brewers in terms of where things were when you started to where they were in 2015?
Yeah, I think, and I don't think this is specific to baseball, but as it relates to the Brewers, the way people consume games at the stadium, there was a much higher value on kind of tribalism and group space and social watching areas as opposed to having your own seat. And that, I still think to this day that's evolving. Um, Variability on ticket plans. It's hard to sell an 81 game season ticket. So how are you adapting to the consumer's wants and needs, whether it's a full season, half season, 20 game plan, you know, Saturdays only, that just was continually evolving. Do you want a credit where you can draw down on the credit? So just meeting the ticket plans where the consumers are was something that changed quite a bit during the first 10 years.
Yeah, that's definitely interesting. And obviously ticketing has continued to evolve, particularly
Yes.
in the next 10 years from that, and we'll hopefully get into that a little bit more. But um, in 2015, you obviously made the decision to go to the Bucks. There were some idiosyncratic things that were happening to the Bucks with the new ownership change, potentially a new.
Mhm.
You talk about why you made the decision to move to the Bucks at that.
Well, when I left the Brewers in 2015, I was head of an entity called Brewers Enterprises, which in event services. So I oversaw our game day staff and operations, but also the non-baseball vertical for the team, which was wonderful and extremely rewarding. The Bucks were going to afford me the opportunity to try and sell naming rights for a new venue in my backyard, as well as a new practice facility. There was a lot of excitement around the team, and it was something at the time I didn't see uh, a chance for that to happen with the Brewers, just given the current setup, longtime sponsors who likely weren't going to move off. And I just thought it was too good of an opportunity to pass up.
And when you talk about new or naming rights, new practice facility, some of our students, are learning about naming rights. So what goes into naming rights and what's the process either for the new building itself, or for the practice facility in terms of identifying the partners, narrative creation, data? How do you think about that with, obviously one of the team's biggest assets?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with the training facility, and this is we didn't reinvent the wheel with the Bucks. Our healthcare partner ended up putting their name on the facility. One of the great things they did is downtown Milwaukee was underserved, in our opinion, from a patient-forward health perspective. So they actually had a public-facing clinic that we included as part of the practice facility, which was fantastic. So that checked a lot of boxes. That was great. The naming rights for the arena, that's again, that's a blank canvas. You can go back and, you know, create a narrative and a justification for why any company in Wisconsin, the region, or globally might want to be involved in that. I mean, it was the NBA of all the leagues, the global positioning is second to none. Um, the Bucks were fortunate; they had a young guy named Giannis who was starting to come into his own, who of course is from Greece. So you had, a non-American who was going to be the face of the franchise, which opened up some global opportunities. And then there was a ton of excitement. I think have you had Peter Fagan on the podcast before? Yeah, I mean, Peter came in from New York, ton of energy, ton of ideas, had a little bit of a Pied Piper effect, great to work with. And, you get him in a room and wind him up and he just goes. And there were a lot of companies that jumped on board because of him. It was great.
Can you talk a little bit more? I think that's an interesting component, a little underplayed about the regional, national, international nature of naming rights deals for a franchise like the Bucks. I don't think intuitively a lot of people understand the global platform that becomes available with naming rights opportunities. I wouldn't say, but like in a city like Milwaukee, which is not one of the, the New Yorks or LAs of the world.
Right. Right. I mean, I actually think it's, I don't want to say easier, but maybe more beneficial to try and sell naming rights in a smaller city like Milwaukee because you can create the narrative or you can create the value proposition with the NBA that, it's a star-driven league. They have, whether it's China or the Philippines or any other country in Europe, their distribution is fantastic. The consumption is unbelievable. Um, so you can look at any corporation in almost any country, and whether it's a B2B or B2C play, you can create that narrative as to why it makes sense. If you're going to advertise, if you're going to engage, why it makes sense to put your name on a building with an NBA team.
And obviously the Bucks partnered and has continued partners with Fiserv.
Mhm.
What was, the process for landing Fiserv, and how did they end up, seeing the value and the opportunity in many ways you articulated already?
Yeah, it was the process was a little bit of a cold call, which
Nothing wrong with that. Yeah.
which was great to their CEO, who was a Buck season seat holder. But that was at the time where fintech as a category was starting to emerge, um, and as you looked at whether it's Fiserv or anybody else in that space servicing financial institutions, they're not just servicing them in Milwaukee. I mean, their headquarters happen to be there, but they're serving them nationally and globally as well. So when you're talking about, from a naming rights perspective, it's not just a marketing play if you're doing it right. It's, employee engagement, it's customer recruitment, it's employee recruitment, it's retention. It should be something that everybody from the head of HR to the CFO to the CMO to the CEO is like, head of sales, like, no, this makes sense. And if you structure it properly, it will.
Particularly the what you just said in terms of CEO, CMO, CFO. What were those conversations like with the senior leadership team, particularly in terms of articulating the business proposition?
So yeah, it was different for each one, as you can imagine, because they're all concerned about different areas. Um, with the CEO, it was making sure that his leadership team was bought in as well. Um, ultimately it was his decision, but he wanted to make sure that across the board, everyone was comfortable and that it was the right thing to do. So the CMO is looking at, it's everything from engagement to impressions nationally and globally. Where are the Bucks sitting for potential nationally televised games as opposed to trajectory for long playoff runs, which of course they won the title in 2021. And what does that look like? It wasn't as much about what are the local impressions, but what are the national and global impressions, not only from television, but digital and engagement in that front. And the CFO is, CFO is a CFO. They're going to look at it from a dollars and cents standpoint, um, analyze it probably relative to other naming rights, at least as you can find the data, other naming rights values for, they always want to pin it to the market size. And then as you're selling, you're always trying to pin it. No, it's, yeah, we're here, but we're a global brand. So again, it's just that finessing the narrative, specifically in that regard.
And one of the other things that was interesting about the Bucks experience is the mixed use capability, the expansion of the what ended up becoming calling the Deer District. Can you talk about
Mhm.
from you know how you were involved in that? And what was the process of trying to commercialize and monetize the mixed use area?
Outside of the training facility, Adam, which was done in conjunction with Fiserv Forum, the Deer District started to really take shape and develop after I had gone back to the Brewers. So I didn't have a ton of involvement in that regard.
I guess from your perspective, obviously I co-authored a paper on mixed use development that came out recently, but you started to see that. I guess you were involved in conversation. So even with the Buck,
Yeah, I mean the narrative that holds true and continues is live, work, and play. They wanted to create a place where there was residential, there was an opportunity for people to congregate outside of just Bucks games, and they've done a really good job with that. Hotel developments. It really was and is a revitalization of a certain section of Milwaukee that was underutilized. And if you can get footfall and traffic 12 months out of the year, not solely dependent on the 41 basketball games, that's a huge win.
yeah, exactly. And we're talking about obviously mixed use developments and kind of increasing. You mentioned that in your first stint with the Brewers in terms of increasing utilization of the venue. So that seemed to be part, obviously, of why you came back. But can you tell us why you came back to the Brewers and what are the opportunities you saw in coming back to the Brewers?
So there was a restructure at the Brewers where the chief revenue officer role was created that hadn't existed before. Um, Obviously, I had a wonderful relationship with Rick Schlesinger, who's the team president there, as well as Mark Attanasio, the owner. Um, I thought there'd never been one individual who was kind of getting the marketing and ticket sales and sponsorships all working in harmony. Um, so I viewed it as a unique opportunity. I enjoyed working in baseball. Um, I saw baseball, there American Family Field, what was Miller Park, sits on approximately 75 acres with 11,000 parking spots. So I thought there might be a development opportunity play there going forward, which I think they're still looking at. I knew naming rights was coming up. For 20 years was Miller Park and was either going to have the opportunity to extend that or go out and search for a new partner, which we ultimately did with American Family Insurance. So there was a lot going on that I thought I'd really enjoy. So that's what I
And
did.
when you talk about bringing it to harmony, right? All those different
Yeah.
revenue streams. What were some of the initial challenges and how did you think about it from a strategic perspective?
So, and I can say this because I cut my teeth in sponsorships, but sponsorship sales people um, tend to be very needy, last minute. Everything's an emergency. Hey, we got to drop everything and do this now. So, really, I mean, understanding and explaining to that group that, hey, there's a process by which we have to do things. Um, you know, our marketing team, our social team, they have a full-time job outside of just dropping everything and helping you, getting figuring out as we're looking at capital projects, what's the best combination for the ticket offering relative to the experience and trying to sell a naming entitlement or a partner on it. Those were all things that I was able to enjoy and do, but were also some of the challenges.
And then you mentioned naming rights, again, one of the marquee assets of any sports team. So what were the lessons you potentially learned from the Milwaukee Bucks experience that you brought to the experience with the Milwaukee Brewers?
So for me, I think it was all about value prop and positioning. And again, I'll go back to working with Peter, who I think I learned a lot from. And when you go out in the market, you know, go out with a real plan, be a little bit more targeted. When I initially went to the Bucks, well, I certainly can make the case that any local, regional, or national company, could put their name on a building. It can't be that much of a shotgun approach, I guess. Be a little bit more laser targeted, refine your narrative, create the value proposition, and then make the approach. Those are some of the things I learned at the Bucks that I took with me to the Brewers.
And then one of the new things that there was a new piece of branding or a new piece of inventory that came online, which is on uniform branding, particularly on the sleeve. What was, can you tell, what that was like to have a new piece of inventory that hadn't existed before? What was that like in terms of understanding the value creation and value proposition? And how does a kind of on sleeve or a jersey patch, which is a substantial asset compared to a naming rights asset?
So yeah, I was fortunate when I was still with the Bucks, the NBA adopted that, and we were able to get Harley Davidson, which um, obviously is a Milwaukee centric brand with a global reach, to go on the Bucks uniform. That was an extremely exciting time. And again, it's creating the same narrative. It's a little bit different value proposition than naming rights in that obviously it's part of the fabric of the uniform, home and road. So it's not just home games, which is a big differentiator. Screen time is a big differentiator. But I'll tell you, when I went to the Brewers and baseball adopted it, the market was getting pretty crowded.
Yeah.
Um, whether it was existing NBA teams who had deals that were up and they were in search for a new partner, or all of a sudden you had every team in Major League Baseball in the marketplace trying to secure a substantial investment from ideally a new partner. Um, so that was not without its challenges.
And then as you're, obviously you're at the Brewers for a while, you mentioned obviously taking on your background in sponsorship, but are there things you learned about the other revenue streams that you were now, obviously in charge of or managing that were not what you were expecting or anticipating, or were there new learnings from managing those other revenue streams?
I was extremely fortunate at the Brewers that the head of ticketing had been there for 20 plus years and he was able to spoon feed me. Um, Well, I certainly felt comfortable in the sponsorship space. The ticketing space was a little bit of a different animal, dynamic pricing, and again, kind of breaking up the ticket plans to meet the needs of the fans. And I mean, specifically in baseball, with 81 games, ticket revenue is, the lifeblood outside of, your regional TV deal for those teams. So it's critically important. And it's everything from him teaching me, how we're submitting our requests to the leagues for the scheduling and what we're thinking about game times, how we're going to look at promotions differently, what we're going to put on different nights. It was an educational process, but one Mr. Jim Bathy was able to help me through it.
Yeah, I'm curious about promotions. That's a topic that comes up a lot in our classes too. So how do you think about promotions and like the strategy around promotions? Because promotions can be a substantial ticket driver.
Oh yeah, I mean, in baseball, I would say the Brewers over-indexed on promotions in a good way. Like I think we were very strategic in how we approached day of the week, time of the year. We did a lot of work with our strategy and analytics department on focus groups and surveys to see what resonated with fans. It was more than just like, hey, we're going to do a magnet schedule. There was a
Right.
lot of work that went into it, and I know a lot of work still goes into it.
And then, you mentioned you weren't necessarily looking to move, you weren't necessarily looking to go back to the NFL or to the Bills. So what was the process? You said the offer was too enticing. Why was the potential to work with the Bills so enticing for you at that point in your career?
Well, it's funny for me on a personal front. My wife and I had just designed and built and moved into a house in 2020, and I'm like, we're never leaving. It's going to be great.
Famous last words, yeah.
Yeah, and then I got off the phone with Pete in July of last year, and I said, "Remember when I said that? Might have been over my skis a little bit." It's a couple of things, and this is a little bit more personal than professional, but my wife and I had been in Buffalo twice in the last 5 years just for odd happenstance. And both times we had commented on how friendly the people are, how nice the market is. People are down to earth, really feels like a Midwest city. So I didn't have to sell her on the city, but the opportunity she understood immediately. You have a brand new $2.2 billion NFL stadium, which, I mean, most people are lucky if they get to work on one new venue in their career, and this will be my second. Um, we have a pretty good quarterback. That helps. But the one thing that I didn't even understand until I talked to Pete a little bit further is the Buffalo Bills HMA, our home market area, is inclusive of all of Southern Ontario, including Toronto. So it's massive. People think of Buffalo as the 53rd ranked market. We're not 53rd in anything.
Right.
The ability to, along with our chief strategy officer who came from baseball, Kate Hussman, craft our plan to kind of wrap our arms around Southern Ontario, give them a hug, and bring them into the Bills Mafia was extremely appealing. It's the equivalent of if Major League Baseball called me in Milwaukee and said, "Oh, by the way, the Cubs and White Sox are leaving. Chicago is now part of your marketing area."
Yeah.
So it was just too attractive to pass up.
You mentioned the new venue. Obviously, that's something that's an interesting asset. When you think about a new venue, and particularly from revenue generation, how much does revenue generation factor into considerations about new venue construction or things that you're looking at from a monetization commercialization perspective?
I think, the cake was largely baked when I got here as far as the design of the building and the stadium. But it's whether it's in Buffalo or in Milwaukee, revenue generation and fan experience are at the forefront of everything we do. One sometimes leads to the other, which is great. But we looked at the stadium here, and we've done a couple of different things than what I think you'd be accustomed to for a new NFL stadium. We have the Bills Mafia. They want to be out in the elements.
Yeah.
And, typically if you go to a new NFL stadium, your more expensive PSLs are closer to the 50 down on the field level. We inverted that because this particular stadium, approximately 65% of the fans are under a canopy. So you're not going to get the snow and the wind, but the Hardy Bills fans want that stuff. So our lesser expensive PSLs are in that lower level where you get to experience the elements and be a part of it. The people you can see behind me, my Zuba snow pants,
Huh.
the people that like to wear those, they're going to be out in the elements. And then the the more expensive kind of premium experience PSLs are a little bit higher up.
Yeah, that's very interesting, right? Yeah, exactly. You'd think it'd be inverted, and that was obviously one of the considerations is whether it would be a dome stadium or an outdoor stadium, particularly given the weather and
Well,
environment.
it's funny. Not only is it not a dome, we're going from artificial turf to natural grass. Um, we're Terry Pagula is fantastic. It's a stadium that he was adamant is built for Buffalo and football first. And the football side of the organization was clear that they preferred to play on grass. We have a sub air system to heat it and pull the moisture out or pump it in if we need to. It's going to be a fantastic facility, not only for playing football, but for watching it.
When we were talking about, from partnership perspective or ticketing, but obviously we just talked about ticketing, but from a partnership perspective, what is it like to engage with partners as a new venue's coming online? And when when you're trying to sell new assets, new inventory, or even similar assets to the old venue, what are those conversations like?
I would say a friend of mine with Legends coined a term that I love. This isn't apples to oranges. This is like apples to dump trucks. Like that's the difference between the two stadiums. And everybody's excited. Not too dissimilar from when I went to Green Bay, though. We are kind of resetting what it means to be a partner, cleaning up, for a number of years, the Bills had a little bit of a playoff drought. I think it was 17 years, I've been told. Um, so there were, When I came into the market, there was an official this, an official that. So we're just cleaning up the nomenclature, the investment level to provide value to those that are investing with us. So everybody understands that and appreciates it. Um, but there's some, there are some relationships we've had where, you know, it may not make sense to continue just based on how we're restructuring things. And that's okay. That's just part of the process and um, creating value for those that are investing in the team.
And then how do you manage an existing venue process with a new venue process? You've kind of articulated that's an idiosyncratic challenge, right? There's something coming online, but you still need to generate revenue from the old building and the old.
Well, and again, this is a credit to Terry and the Pagula family. They were very adamant that every existing season seat holder, bear in mind, you may or may not be aware, but we're going from 71,000 seats to approximately 60.
Yeah. Wow.
So the venue itself will be smaller, but Terry and family were very adamant that every existing season seat holder in Highmark Stadium had a chance to go through our preview center and get the opportunity to buy a seat in that venue before we went to a wait list. Um, the sales are going great. For all intents and purposes, suites and premium are sold out. The lower bowl and upper bowl are filling in, but it was very intentional to give everybody that's been doing business with us for so many years and quite frankly, with us through the lean times, the chance to get into that building. So in this particular instance, Adam, we have partnered with Legends, who's running that preview center and that PSL process, working hand in hand with the Bills. Um, but they have no less than 40 to 50 people in the preview center taking everybody through, explaining the process, allowing them to select their seat. It would be hard to do, I think, as a complement with just existing, whether it's Bill staff or any other team.
And then you mentioned Toronto and obviously the size of the Toronto and Southern Ontario market. One difference between Chicago and Southern Ontario is obviously football itself and knowledge of football and the fact that hockey obviously is can be considered, or is the top sport in Canada. How do you, when you think about that in terms of reaching a new market, because that's not just in Canada, but the NFL is expanding internationally as well. How do you
Sure.
think about reaching international fans?
So fortunately for us, we're the number one team in Canada currently,
Yeah.
and Bills games are consumed at a fairly high clip north of the border. So the education process isn't, it's not a heavy lift. But what we need to do as an organization is authentically integrate ourselves into Southern Ontario, and we're looking at ways to do that through Girls Flag, working with Football Canada, really, understanding creating tentpole events that will live in Canada, trying to figure out what that looks like. That's the biggest, when I say it's not even a challenge, it's an opportunity.
Yeah.
How are we going to authentically integrate ourselves into Southern Ontario so that they do feel like, hey, the Bills are our team, and we're taking steps to do that.
And one final question as we wrap up here is the same question we ask all of our guests, which is you've been in many positions of leadership and authority. You're obviously hiring people all the time or thinking about hiring people. We have a lot of students and people who are listening to the podcast who are trying to either enter or progress in the sports industry. So, from your perspective, what are the qualities that make a successful candidate for somebody who's looking to enter or progress in the sports field?
I mean, the biggest thing for me is, and I always say grit. Like you got to be willing to grind. It's not just going to be handed to you. I also think that a lot of times people are focused on kind of the IQ portion of the job, where I think EQ is equally, if not more important. Like you have to understand who you're talking to. You can be the smartest person in the room, but if you can't relate to the person you're talking to, it just doesn't come across as authentic. So I would say grit and hard work and work on that, the EQ and the communication skills. We live in a world of 280 characters and social media, but you still need to know how to properly write an email, write a letter, correspond, send a handwritten thank you note. You'd be shocked at the dividends that pays.
Yeah, you're definitely not the first person to bring up the handwritten thank you notes. People do love those. So, Jason, appreciate all the time you spent with us. We covered a lot of ground. I think there's a lot more that we could cover. So maybe we'll have you. Hopefully, we can have you back on a future episode.
Sure.
But
Sure. Well, we have to get you out here to Buffalo to do a stadium tour.
no question, I'd love to go out there. So it's great to see you. Great to talk to you, and thanks for making the time.
Yeah, great seeing you again. Thanks, Adam.